For the longest time, finding the next great athlete was, well, it was more of an art than a science, right? It was all about a coach's gut feeling, a lucky break, or just happening to be in the right place at the right time. But then, in the 20th century, a revolution kicked off. The whole game changed. The search for talent went from being a game of chance to a calculated science. So today, we're going to dive into how that science evolved from the drawing board all the way to the Olympic podium.
Okay, let's kick things off with a really powerful thought from Voltaire. Now, obviously, he wasn't talking about sports, but his point, it's the absolute foundation for everything we're about to get into. This idea that matching the right person to the right task is just crucial for success. In the world of elite sports, this isn't just some nice philosophy, it's the formula for winning.
And that really brings us to the big question, doesn't it? For decades, a champion just sort of appeared. It felt like a lightning strike, rare, random, completely unpredictable. But what if you could build a system to catch that lightning? What if you could actually design a system for success? This is the story of that huge shift from just waiting for champions to happen to actively engineering the systems that create them. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. The old way, gut feelings and luck. The new way, scientific systems and hard data. And the person who really embodied this new way was a guy named Manfred Ewald from East Germany. He came from politics, and he applied this ruthlessly systematic approach. He treated sport not as a fun pastime, but as a massive national project to be executed with cold scientific precision. And the results? They were absolutely staggering. Think about it. A country with fewer than 18 million people, and Ewald's East Germany finished second in the medal count at both the 1976 and 1980 Olympics. This was no fluke. This was proof. Proof that a small nation could become a sporting superpower, not by luck, but by pure, cold design. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the science and the theories behind it all. Then we'll look at the actual blueprints the Eastern Bloc used. After that, we'll see how the rest of the world adapted these models, and we'll wrap up with the modern, holistic approach that's being used right now. First things first, let's get into the science, because before you can build any kind of system, you need a theory. You need a framework for understanding what talent even is. And a few key thinkers really laid the groundwork for all of this. So you can see how the thinking here evolved, and it happened pretty fast. The early theories were pretty simple, just two-step physical screening. But then the thinking shifted. It became about assessing performance after an athlete had learned some skills. Then it got even more complex, a multidimensional view that looked at everything from medical history to how important good coaching and support systems were. The big breakthrough was realizing that finding talent wasn't just a single test, but a long-term process tied to a kid's natural growth and development. Okay, so what's the actual difference between a theory and a model? It's pretty simple, really. A theory, that's the why. It gives us the big ideas, the core concepts. A model, on the other hand, is the how. It's the practical, step-by-step blueprint for taking those big ideas and turning them into real-world action. So, we've got the why. Now let's jump into the how. We're talking about the actual blueprints, the models that nations started using to put all this theory into practice. And you can really see how these models grew up over the years. Back in the 70s, they were combining physical data with things like psychology. Fast forward to the 2000s, and we start seeing these much clearer pathways, from just detecting talent to developing it long-term. The real game changers were, 1, aligning these stages with biological maturity, and 2, creating age-appropriate phases. A sampling phase where kids can just try stuff out, all the way to an investment phase for elite young adults. All right, now we get to where the rubber really meets the road. This is the first large-scale application of all these ideas. The systems in the Eastern Bloc. These weren't just theories on paper. They were massive, nationwide projects designed to systematically engineer sporting dominance. The Soviet Union, they were really the pioneers here. As early as 1952, they rolled out this super structured 3-stage model. It started with basic selection for the little kids, then moved on to initial and final selection by the time they were 14. And this whole thing was built on this huge network of sports schools, basically creating a conveyor belt for talent. And then there was the East German machine. Man, this thing was infamous for a reason. It was just brutally efficient. Stage 1. Standardized physical tests for every single school child in the entire country.
From that massive pool, the most promising kids moved to stage 2 for some intense scientific and medical testing. The best of the best were then funneled into elite sports schools, becoming, for all intents and purposes, full-time athletes of the state. China took a similar approach, but they visualized it as this massive pyramid. At the wide base, you have millions of kids just doing recreational sports. As they get older, they go through a series of exams, and the pyramid gets narrower and narrower. The most talented keep moving up, from local sports schools to provincial ones, and finally to the national academies right at the very peak. So with all that going on, what did the rest of the world do? Well, democratic nations couldn't just copy and paste these giant state-run models. It just wouldn't work. So instead, they had to adapt. They took the scientific principles, the systematic testing, the data analysis, and figured out how to weave them into their own very different social and political structures. Australia is just a perfect case study for this. They had a really humbling 1976 Olympics, 0 gold medals, and that was a huge wake-up call. It spurred a complete overhaul. They brought in a 3-stage approach, widespread testing in schools, then advanced lab work for the top prospects, and finally, channeling those athletes into elite programs like the Australian Institute of Sport. By blending Eastern Bloc science with a Western framework, they turned themselves into a sporting powerhouse. Then the UK comes along with this super clever idea they called talent transfer. The concept is so simple but so smart. What if a world-class athlete is just stuck in the wrong sport? The Girls for Gold program, for example, went out and found strong, powerful female athletes in different sports and tested them to see if they'd be good at something else, like rowing or skeleton. And it worked. They won multiple Olympic medals from athletes who might have never found their perfect sport otherwise. So all these different ideas and innovations, they kind of led us to where we are today, to the current state of the art. While programs like talent transfer were great for maximizing existing talent, the next step was to build a system that nurtured talent right from the very beginning. And the best example of this holistic approach is Canada's Long-Term Athlete Development Model, or LTAD. And the scope of this model is just incredible. I mean, it's literally a pathway from when you're a toddler all the way to adulthood. It starts with just making being active fun for little kids, then slowly introduces more specific skills. And get this, the goal isn't just to create Olympic champions. The final stage is active for life. It's about ensuring athletes can transition into being healthy, active adults. It's a whole philosophy focused on developing great people, not just great athletes. Of course, building one of these massive, complex systems from scratch, well, that comes with its own set of challenges. Starting back in 1999, Iran began a real focused effort to implement its own scientific talent ID system, and it gives us a really valuable look at what that development journey is like. And Iran's journey really shows you that this is an ongoing process, right? It's an evolution. They started with the standard 3-stage models, and now they're working on much more detailed frameworks. But they're facing challenges that are pretty universal. Getting all the different institutions to work together, standardizing data, stuff like that. It really highlights the key lesson here. No system is ever finished. It has to constantly be refined and adapted. Okay, so after this whole trip around the globe, looking at different eras and different systems, what's the big takeaway? What are the common threads that tie all of these successful talent identification systems together? So what really makes one of these systems tick? First, it's not a one-time test. It's a long-term pathway. It has to integrate the hard science with psychological and social support. And maybe most importantly, there's no magic one-size-fits-all blueprint. The best systems are the ones that adapt these core principles to fit their own unique culture. The key thing to remember is this: finding talent is a process, not a single event. And we'll end with this thought from Roger Federer, who is, one of the most gifted athletes ever. He said, "Talent is a gift, but without discipline, it takes you nowhere." And that's the perfect way to wrap this up. A system can identify potential, it can open the door, but it's the discipline and the hard work of the athlete that actually carries them across the finish line. Talent might be the start of the journey, but discipline, that's the engine that actually gets you there.